The air buzzed with tension as the crowd gathered at Liberty Hall. Cameras flashed, voices rose, and the atmosphere felt electric, almost dangerous. Donald Trump, with his unmistakable presence, stood at the podium, his fiery tone matching the energy of the restless crowd. His words, strong and unapologetic, stirred applause and grumbles alike. Among the audience, a lone voice shattered the rhythm. A passionate activist, young but intense, stood up and shouted, "Enough of the division, we're tired of the hate." Gasps rippled through the crowd as security moved in, their imposing figures flanking the young man. But he wasn't deterred. Tears streaked his face as he yelled, "What about unity? What about love for our neighbors? Isn't that what America is supposed to be?" Trump's face hardened. The crowd roared in response, some cheering, others jeering. The activist, trembling yet unyielding, raised his voice higher. "You're a father, a grandfather. Don't you care about what kind of world your grandchildren will live in?" As chaos threatened to erupt, a figure emerged from the shadows. Ivanka Trump, with grace and poise, walked onto the stage. Her calm presence silenced the noise, but what she would do next was something no one could have predicted. Ivanka approached the podium, her hands clasped together. Her father looked at her, a mix of pride and confusion flashing across his face. The crowd hushed, eager to see what would happen next. "Dad," she began softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Let me speak for a moment." Donald stepped back, his lips pressed tight, allowing her to take center stage. She turned to the young activist, her gaze steady but kind. "What's your name?" The young man hesitated, his defiance waning under her calm demeanor. "Ethan," he finally said, his voice cracking. "Ethan," Ivanka repeated gently. "I hear your pain, and I understand your anger. But shouting won't heal this divide. Can we talk? Can we listen to each other, even if we don't agree?" Ethan stared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The crowd seemed frozen in time, every eye fixed on the stage. "I don't want to fight," Ivanka continued, her voice now firm. "I want to understand, and I want my father to hear you too." She turned to Donald. "Dad, will you listen?" For a moment, Donald Trump's expression softened, revealing something rarely seen, a glimmer of vulnerability. "All right," he said gruffly. "I'll listen." Ethan stood in silence, overwhelmed by the unexpected shift. Ivanka stepped down from the podium, walking toward him slowly. She gestured for him to join her on stage. "I'm nobody," Ethan mumbled, shaking his head. "Just a guy who's tired of the hate." "You're not nobody," Ivanka replied, her voice steady and warm. "You're someone who cares enough to speak up. That matters." With hesitation, Ethan climbed the steps. The audience watched, some wiping tears, others murmuring softly. Donald Trump folded his arms, his gaze locked on the scene unfolding before him. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice trembling. "I grew up in a broken home. My dad left when I was 8. My mom worked 3 jobs. We struggled, but she always told me to stand up for what's right." His voice broke. I want people to care about each other. Is that too much to ask?" Ivanka reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's not too much," she said softly. She looked at the crowd, her voice rising. "We've all felt broken at some point, but we can choose to build something better, together." Tears welled in many eyes as an unexpected hush fell over the room. Something profound was happening, and it had only just begun. The silence in the room was heavy, almost unbearable. Ethan, standing on the stage next to Ivanka, couldn't hold back his tears anymore. He wiped his face, his hands trembling. "I don't hate you," he said, his voice raw. "I'm just scared. Scared of what's happening to us as people." Donald Trump, known for his commanding presence and fiery rhetoric, looked uncomfortable. For a moment, it seemed like he wanted to say something, but he held back. Ivanka, sensing the fragility of the moment, stepped closer to her father. "Dad," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room, "do you remember what you told me when I was little? You said a leader isn't someone who speaks the loudest, but someone who listens the most." Trump blinked, his face betraying a flicker of emotion. The crowd was utterly still, hanging on every word. Ivanka turned back to Ethan. "You said you grew up without a father," she began, her voice quivering. "But here you are, standing tall, trying to make things better. That takes courage." Ethan looked at her, his expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Slowly, the walls of hostility began to crumble. An elderly woman in the crowd stood up. Her face was lined with years of wisdom and hardship. "I lost my husband in the war," she said, her voice shaking. "He fought for a country that was supposed to be united. But now, I don't recognize it anymore." Her words struck a chord. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded, others wiped tears from their eyes. Ivanka stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "Ma'am," she said, her tone filled with warmth. "Thank you for sharing your story. Your husband's sacrifice reminds us of what we owe each other: kindness, respect, and hope." Donald Trump, usually unyielding, seemed to soften. He glanced at the elderly woman, then at Ethan, and finally at Ivanka. "It's easy to argue," he said, his voice lower than usual. "But maybe it's time we start listening more." The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was reflective. People shifted in their seats, some reaching out to hold the hands of those next to them. A strange, almost sacred energy filled the space. And just like that, a spark of unity began to flicker. Ethan, still overwhelmed, took a deep breath. "I never thought I'd be standing here," he admitted. "I came to this event angry. I wanted to shout, to be heard, but I didn't expect to feel this." "What do you feel?" Ivanka asked gently, her eyes locked on his. "Hope," he whispered. "For the first time in a long time, I feel hope." The crowd stirred. A young girl sitting in the front row raised her hand timidly. Ivanka nodded at her, inviting her to speak. "My grandpa is here," the girl said, pointing to an older man in a wheelchair. "He always says we're stronger together. He fought in the civil rights movement." The older man nodded, his voice weak but steady. "It's true," he said. "I've seen dark times, but I've also seen what we can do when we come together. Don't let fear win. Choose love. Always choose love." Ivanka's eyes glistened with tears as she turned to the crowd. "Let's honor this wisdom. Let's build bridges, not walls, in our hearts." The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't loud. It was soft, reverent, like the sound of a healing wound. Something profound was happening, and no one wanted it to stop. Donald Trump shifted uneasily, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't used to being challenged, let alone in such a vulnerable setting. The words of the elderly man and the young activist lingered in his mind. It wasn't the usual political arena where strength was shown by standing firm. This was something different, something human. Ivanka turned to her father. "Dad," she said softly, "you've always been a fighter. But sometimes strength isn't about fighting. It's about understanding." Trump's expression softened just for a moment, and he nodded almost imperceptibly. The audience, filled with people of all ages, seemed to hold its collective breath. "You're right, Ivanka," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I've spent my life building things, leading, pushing forward. But maybe I've forgotten to stop and listen. Maybe that's what we all need to do more of." His words sent a ripple through the crowd. It wasn't a grand speech or a campaign promise, it was something rare: humility. Ethan stared at him, his anger melting into surprise. "You really mean that?" he asked cautiously. Trump nodded. "Yes, I do." Ethan stood motionless, processing what had just happened. For years he had carried anger in his heart, believing no one in power cared. But here, in this moment, something felt different. "I've spent so much time shouting," Ethan admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought if I screamed loud enough, someone would hear me. I never imagined I'd see this side of you." Donald Trump stepped forward, his towering presence now less intimidating and more approachable. "I can't change everything overnight," he said, "but I can start by hearing you out. Tell me what you want people to know." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He glanced at the crowd, his voice trembling. "I want us to stop seeing each other as enemies. We're all human. We all hurt. We all dream. We all love. Can't we focus on that?" The audience murmured in agreement. Even those who had come with skepticism seemed moved. Ivanka smiled, her hand gently resting on Ethan's shoulder. "That's the kind of bravery we need," she said. "Not the bravery to fight, but the bravery to hope." For the first time that night, Ethan felt lighter. The weight of his anger had started to lift. As Ethan's words settled over the crowd, an older man in a veteran's uniform stood up. His trembling hands held a faded photograph. "This is my son," he said, his voice breaking. "He died overseas, fighting for this country. He believed in unity, in people coming together. Tonight, I feel like his spirit is here." The room erupted into quiet sobs. Strangers reached out to comfort one another. Tears streamed down Ivanka's face as she stepped off the stage and walked toward the veteran. She knelt beside him and held his hand. "Your son's sacrifice means more than words can express," she said gently. Donald Trump, uncharacteristically subdued, approached the man as well. He placed a hand on his shoulder. "We owe everything to people like your son," he said, "and we owe it to him to do better for the next generation." The veteran nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Then let's do better," he whispered. The crowd was no longer divided. In that room, for those few moments, they were one. The walls of fear, anger, and division began to crumble, leaving only raw humanity behind. The night wasn't over, but something extraordinary was beginning. The veteran's heartfelt words seemed to hang in the air like a sacred hymn. As Ivanka stood beside him, tears welled in her eyes. She glanced back at her father, who had grown unusually quiet. The Donald Trump standing there now wasn't the brash, larger-than-life figure people were used to seeing. He looked deeply moved, his hand resting lightly on the veteran's shoulder. "Your son's bravery will never be forgotten," Trump said softly, his voice laced with emotion. "And neither will yours for carrying his legacy." Ethan, still standing on the stage, felt a strange pull inside him. Without thinking, he stepped forward and hugged the veteran. The older man froze for a moment, then returned the embrace, his body trembling as he sobbed into Ethan's shoulder. The room erupted into a collective outpouring of emotions. Strangers embraced, tears streaming freely. Some whispered prayers, others shared words of comfort. Even the security guards, usually stoic and distant, looked visibly affected. Ivanka took a deep breath, her voice cutting through the sobs. "This is who we are when we put our hearts first," she said. "This is what unity looks like." The crowd applauded, not out of politeness, but as an expression of hope. As the applause died down, Donald Trump cleared his throat and took a step toward the microphone. His usual confidence seemed tempered by the raw vulnerability in the room. "I'm not perfect," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I've made mistakes, plenty of them, and I know I've said things that have hurt people. But tonight," he paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Tonight, I've seen something I'll never forget." Ethan stared at him, his anger now fully replaced by curiosity. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Trump met Ethan's eyes. "I saw people willing to forgive, people willing to listen, and that's more powerful than any speech or policy I could ever give." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. For a man often accused of arrogance, this moment of humility felt monumental. Ivanka stepped beside her father, her hand gently resting on his arm. "We all have the power to change," she said, "but it starts with admitting we need to." The audience nodded, many wiping their eyes. A quiet understanding began to settle in the room, a shared sense of purpose that transcended differences. As the event continued, something remarkable began to happen. People from opposite sides of the room who had arrived as enemies started to talk to each other. A man in a business suit leaned over to a young activist and said, "I don't agree with you, but I'd like to understand your perspective." Nearby, an older woman handed her handkerchief to a crying teenager, whispering, "We're all in this together, dear." Ethan, still standing on the stage, felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He turned to Ivanka. "You did this," he said. She shook her head. "No, Ethan. We did this. All of us." Donald Trump, watching the scene unfold, seemed lost in thought. He turned to Ivanka and whispered, "Maybe it's not too late to change things." "It's never too late, Dad," she replied. The evening ended, not with grand speeches or bold declarations, but with the quiet hum of connection. As the crowd dispersed, many left with tears in their eyes, hearts heavier but also fuller. Outside, the stars shone brighter than they had in years, as if the heavens themselves were celebrating the first steps of healing. The next morning, as the family gathered in their private residence, Ivanka found an envelope slipped under the door. The handwriting was shaky, as though the writer's hand trembled with every word. She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from the elderly veteran who had shared his story the previous night. The words were simple, yet deeply moving. "Ivanka, I've lived a long life, 92 years to be exact. I've seen wars, victories, and heartbreaks. Last night, I saw something I've been praying for all my life, understanding. You gave us that moment. It wasn't just about politics. It was about hope. My son, Michael, believed that kindness could change the world. He always said, if we stop fighting each other, maybe we'll finally hear what our hearts are trying to say. I never got to say goodbye to him, but last night, I felt like I did. Thank you for that." With gratitude, Henry Ivanka read the letter aloud, her voice trembling. Tears welled up in her eyes as she folded the paper. Her father looked at her, uncharacteristically quiet, and said, "Sometimes, moments like these are bigger than us." Donald Trump sat alone in his study, the letter from Henry still in his hands. The words echoed in his mind, stirring something he hadn't felt in a long time. He thought about his life, the choices he had made, and the legacy he wanted to leave behind. For decades he had been a builder of skyscrapers, brands, and influence. But what had he built that truly mattered? His mind wandered back to the event. Ethan's passionate plea, the veteran's heartbreak, and Ivanka's quiet strength had created a moment of raw humanity. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about connection. He picked up his phone and called Ivanka. "I've been thinking about Henry's letter," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "It's made me realize something. I've spent so much of my life trying to be strong that I forgot strength isn't about standing tall. It's about lifting others." Ivanka's voice was warm on the other end. "Dad, it's never too late to start." For the first time in years, Donald Trump felt a sense of peace. The walls he had built around his heart began to crumble, brick by brick. The story of the event quickly spread, capturing the hearts of millions. Social media was flooded with posts about the veteran's letter, Ethan's speech, and Ivanka's powerful intervention. People from all walks of life shared their own stories of pain, hope, and healing. One video, in particular, went viral. It showed the moment when Ethan and Henry embraced, their tears flowing freely. The caption read, "This is what humanity looks like." In nursing homes, older viewers watched the footage with tears in their eyes. "It's been a long time since I've seen something this real," one elderly woman said to her caretaker. At schools, teachers played the video for their students, using it as a lesson in empathy. "Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is listen," one teacher explained. Meanwhile, Ivanka received thousands of letters from people around the world, thanking her for her compassion. Some even shared how the moment had inspired them to mend broken relationships in their own lives. Donald Trump watched the news coverage quietly, his expression unreadable. But inside, he knew this wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was the start of something much bigger. It was late at night when Ivanka's phone rang. She saw her father's name on the screen. His calls at such odd hours were rare. She answered, her voice steady but curious. "Ivanka," Donald's voice came through, quieter than usual. "I need to ask you something." "What is it, Dad?" she asked, sitting up in her bed. "I've been thinking about that event, about Henry and Ethan, about what you said, about what I said. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. Do you think it's too late for me to make things right? To show people I care more than they think I do? Ivanka's heart softened. She had never heard her father sound this vulnerable. Dad, it's never too late. People just want to see the real you, the man who built skyscrapers not just with steel, but with vision. The father who taught me to believe in myself. Show them that side of you. There was silence for a moment. Then Donald Trump said, I want to write back to Henry, and I want to meet Ethan again. I want to listen this time. Ivanka smiled, tears in her eyes. That's the first step, Dad. A month later, another event was organized. This time, it was different. There was no grand stage, no booming announcements. Instead, it was an intimate gathering of veterans, activists, and community leaders. Donald Trump stood at the center, holding a letter he had written to Henry. His hands trembled slightly as he read it aloud. Henry, your words have stayed with me every day. You reminded me of something I'd lost sight of, how much we owe to the sacrifices of others. You gave me the courage to reflect on my actions and the desire to do better. When he finished, the room was silent. Henry, sitting in the front row, stood and walked up to Donald. He extended a shaky hand, but Trump surprised everyone by pulling him into a heartfelt hug. Ethan watched from the side, tears streaming down his face. Ivanka, standing next to him, placed a hand on his shoulder. This is what you fought for, Ethan, she said. The crowd began to clap, then stood, their applause echoing with hope. It wasn't about politics or power anymore, it was about humanity. As the event ended, people lingered, reluctant to leave. Donald Trump stayed longer than anyone expected, shaking hands, listening to stories, and even sharing a few of his own. Ivanka watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride. For the first time in years, she saw her father not as the public figure the world debated, but as the man she knew, a man capable of great change. As the lights dimmed, Ethan approached the microphone one last time. Tonight wasn't about winning or losing, he said. It was about remembering who we are and what we can be when we choose empathy. The crowd erupted in applause, some people openly weeping. As the video cameras recorded every moment, Ivanka stepped forward to speak. Thank you for being part of this journey, she said, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Subscribe to this channel, like the video, and leave a comment about what this moment means to you. Together, let's keep spreading the message that connection, love, and understanding can truly change the world. As the viewers hit the like button and began sharing their thoughts, a single truth emerged. Change starts with a single moment of courage.